Okay, so welcome to the first episode of the podcast that we're setting up. Today I have Kat, so we're going to be talking about some legal changes that have been in the media lately around mobile phones being banned in school. But before we get to that, it's probably a good idea to introduce ourselves. So Kat?
Yeah, so my name is Kat. I'm an assistant professor here at Coventry. I kind of do lots of work around sort of child development education, and I specialise in things like the impact of screens on child development, particularly things like cognition and literacy and language development. So, you know, what happens when a young person is kind of on a screen all of the time. But it's kind of my interest has sort of expanded a little bit because it's kind of also like the impact of things like social media as well on screens, and I kind of teach all of our sort of educational and developmental stuff, so that's where our students will probably have seen me or maybe will see me in the future. But yeah.
Awesome. And I'm Alex, so I'm a lecturer at Coventry as well. My area is a bit mixed, so it's more about like cognitive psychology with like flavours of education. So I've done stuff looking at like math cognition, so how do we deal with numbers, math disorders, things like math anxiety, looked a little bit at dyscalculia, and usually it's a lot of stuff around executive functions, so working memory, sustained attention, stuff like that, and sprinkled in a bit of like neuropsychology, used EEG and TMS and stuff like that. Okay, so I mentioned we've got a new government kind of regulation. I'm not going to call it a law. So the BBC, I saw they had an article and it said something like new law bans bans phones in schools. But the actual regulation doesn't really stipulate it as a law. I don't know if have you seen the regulation?
So we were talking about this, weren't we, literally just before we kind of started recording. So I've actually put myself on a bit of a screen ban recently, ironically, with what we're talking about. So because I've been so busy with sort of like work stuff, I've sort of tried to kind of focus my sort of attention, and one of the things I thought maybe would help me do that was kind of reducing my screen time in general, but actually more specifically kind of reducing how much sort of media and news I was reading. So I got to a point where, because I try and not have too much of my own social media, but we always, as humans, I think we've got this desire to sort of know what's going on. I think that's why social media is so attractive and enthralling, because we are predispositioned to want to know what's going on in our environment and like the wider world. Because I didn't have that kind of social media, the way that I sort of got my little kind of what's going on sort of like hit or kind of like fix was that I was just doom scrolling the news basically, but I was doing it so much. I'd write an email, I'd do a bit of marking, and then kind of like within 20 minutes, like obviously your attention starts to lap and you look at your phone and you think, I'm just going to have a look. But I wasn't going on TikTok, I wasn't going on anything else, I was going on the news, and I think my focus had just sort of started to shift from kind of like local sort of priorities, like, you know, what's going on with my little girl or my family or at home and my friends, and all I was thinking about was what's happening in the wider world. And obviously we know there's so much going on in the wider world that before I knew it, my whole perspective had just kind of gone global, and I was missing out on some of the really more important things. And I would say that since cutting it out, I've started to really appreciate the little things around me. This is going to sound really cheesy, but just, you know, driving down the street, seeing like the daffodils or whatever, the spring flowers. I saw some white bluebells the other day and I was just like, wow, would I have picked up on this kind of like walking along sort of like 4 or 5 weeks ago? But in turn, that means that I'm actually a little bit behind now in terms of sort of like global and current affairs. So even though this is a big part of my area, until you mentioned it, I wasn't aware that they'd actually done it, because I've just been blanket media ban. Yeah.
Okay. No, I mean, what you were saying about social media being depressing, I mean, I get it. I found out that there's a setting on, so I don't really use social media. The only things that I have is an Instagram that I'll flick through. Mm-hmm. Don't really post anything on it. I have Facebook, but I don't use it. I don't do anything on it. But I've found that Meta, that own both of them, have a setting on both of the apps, or the desktop versions that you can basically block political content.
Oh, no,
And it's really, really good, because as soon as I found it, I was like, yes, I'm immediately switching this on. And so my Instagram feed is now just like cats. It's just funny videos of cats, and I've got a bunch of like my favourite cats that I just like to watch, just like their daily lives. And it's so much nicer to not be filled around politics. So, I mean, I didn't actually know about this regulation coming out until I saw the BBC article, just being like, new laws come out. So I went through the regulation earlier, actually, and actually kind of liked it. So I wasn't expecting to kind of go into it and be like, oh yeah, this is like a well thought out regulation. But generally, their approach is it's not necessarily a law, as in phones are just banned, or just blanket banned, because they've got a pretty good recognition of the fact that school isn't like a universal, uniform thing. So one of the things that they identify as being like a very valid use for a child to have a phone on them, and therefore have it with them in school, is to have access to communication when they're travelling to school and travelling back. So I know that lots of people have generally kind of expressed concerns around owning phones and like making sure that they can keep in touch with their child in case something happens. And so there were like, I suppose, like examples rather than case studies. They were like, hey, we've got regulation and guidance that show that here are a bunch of schools that just have like lockers that students have to come in, or they give them to the teacher at the start of the day or whatever, and so they can have their phones when they come in, put them in a place that they no longer have access to them, and then claim them afterwards when they go home, which I think is a good kind of evidence that they're thinking about the practical uses. They were also talking about, obviously, things like disabilities. So they have the example of if you have, there are like fancy glucose meters, or if you've got diabetes, that are linked to phones.
My best friend is type 1 diabetic. She has the thing in her arm, and it's beep every kind of like, so she would need a phone on it all the time.
Yeah. So they'd obviously recognise that this is a thing that people need to do, and went, so in this scenario, you would let that child have that phone. And it was very much emphasised around the blanket default is to not have phones, but schools can choose to let the kids have phones if they want to. There is like a regulation of the default is this, but you can adjust it as and when needed. I mean, they were talking about like residential like trips. So what happens if you go away? When can students have phones? And they were talking about like if it's in the like learning time, they probably shouldn't have them, but again, it's kind of up to the schools to figure them out. Sixth form schools as well, so you've got like maybe a primary school and a high school and sixth form, or a high school and sixth form. They're saying like sixth form students should probably be allowed to have phones, because sixth form is about, okay, you're independent, you should be able to self-monitor, but also that schools should recognise that if your sixth form students have phones, they probably shouldn't have them out in front of the other students, because then it kind of distracts them and so on. So there was some pretty like I wasn't expecting it to be as like encompassing of the other issues that you might find, and like a lot of again like consideration that like your school's kind of responsible. They do also have the ability for. I mean, schools can already do this, but again, like specifically now, you can do this for phones as well. Is like you can do bag checks and stuff like that. So they specifically say the head teacher can do it, but the head teacher can nominate staff to do it as well. So if a student's phone goes off in their bag, the teacher is allowed to basically take the bag and go through and take the phone. Something that was interesting, and I would be interested in seeing how they maybe apply this. Because I can see lots of potential issues, is there is a statement of teachers, as long as they do it in a sensible way, aren't legally liable for any damage to that phone, basically.
Risky.
Yeah. So
risky.
I do understand it. Like if a child has their phone and they shouldn't have it, and the teacher tries to get it and it gets dropped or something, then the teacher's kind of like, well, I'm enforcing the government regulation, the school rules here, and that student was fighting against that.
Or if it was already damaged, and there's all sorts of like,
you don't. Wild example, I put it in my desk, in my drawer in my desk, and there's a leak, and the phone gets damaged in the leak. I drop my cup or something. So there's a bit more protection for the teachers to be able to remove the phones from the students and not be like accused and held kind of like accountable for anything that's happened. there are obviously, it was as long as you do it in a sensible way. If the teacher's being reckless and they take the phone and throw it onto their desk or something, then that's obviously not going to stand.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like that's maybe where you're going to find some early teething problems with these rules.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've got any thoughts. I feel like the problem is going to be, we've got, for example, the cigarette ban that's come in for people that were born after a specific cut-off period. That's going to be quite easy to implement comparatively, because you've got a point where you just go, okay, now you can't do this.
Mm-hmm.
With this phone ban, you'll have year 10 students that have been using their phone in classes for like 7 or 8 years, maybe they had them in primary school, and you've kind of got this problem where now they've all of a sudden got to adjust.
Mm-hmm.
And like that's a really, really significant adjustment for them. Whereas the new students that are then starting to come into, your 4 or 5 year old kids that are going to move into this system, it's going to be a lot easier.
Mm.
So I definitely see the first few years being difficult to see these regulations. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on...
Yeah, so I think some of the things that you mentioned, I was sort of thinking of as you were kind of talking through it. So I don't know why, but the smoking ban came into my mind as well. I think it's probably because obviously I'm nearly 40, so I remember the smoking ban coming in, and it was like, and this is not the one where obviously like younger generations won't be able to smoke at all, but when they literally went from you could smoke in public places to you cannot smoke.
Yeah.
And I just remember it being so strange, because just one day you could and then the next day you just could not. And in my misspent youth I might have socially smoked one cigarette or two, but and I just remember it being, I think it must have come in when we were sort of like about that kind of 17, 18, maybe 18, 19, I don't know, that kind of like age. And I just remember it being very different from one day to the next, and it took people time to adjust to that. And I think like any of this kind of like behaviour change, you're always going to get resistance to the point at which it becomes the new normal. So, I remember for years after, certain pubs were having lock-ins where they were just allowing it anyway, or other pubs were like, oh, we've always let people smoke, we're just going to do it because our locals want to and they won't come to the pub. And by alcohol, I mean, we know that people don't go to the pub as much anymore, but that's probably not, just because of the smoking ban. But I think now we would find it very strange if someone started smoking like next to us in a pub or even a cinema or whatever. And our parents' generation remember when you could literally smoke in cinemas. My dad says that to me all the time. And I mean, to be honest, he does still smoke roll-ups, and he's 70 something, and I'm trying to get him to stop. But he has gone through several kind of like generational shifts. So I suppose in a roundabout way, what I'm trying to say is these things have probably always been going on, where they've suddenly stopped a behaviour because they've realised about the health implications or the psychological implications. And at the time it probably felt jarring, but then it's just become normal. And I'm wondering whether or not, my little girl's 7, by the time she's at high school, whether or not it would just be granted. And just, I mean, what other bans could have come in before then? Will it be, she keeps talking to me at the moment about like, when can I have a phone already? She's 7, because she sees it on things like YouTube and her friends talk about it, and she sees some of the older kids with them, and she's desperate to have her own TikTok channel. And she's like, when can I have a TikTok channel, and when can I do this? But I'm just wondering whether or not, by the time she is older, that 16-year-old social media ban, they may have decided to do that. And I've sort of already tried to kind of foreshadow that to her a bit. I'm like, well, to be honest, darling, they're thinking about me, making it so you can't until you're much, much older. Because she definitely struggles, I think, with the idea that because it's down very much to sort of individual parents, families, households, and obviously individual schools, she struggles when she sees a much younger child allowed one, and then other instances they're not allowed it till they're much older. We went round a family's house, some of our extended family, a couple of weeks ago, and one of their much younger children, like still older than Cara, but probably a lot younger than I would have expected to have a phone, was sort of sitting there on their own phone. And obviously this kind of sort of blew Cara's mind a little bit. She was just like, well, that means that I'm going to get one at this age. And I was just kind of trying to have to explain to her that no, for us, that's not going to be okay. I'm sorry, Cara, like you're not going to get one until you're at least in high school. So I suppose the other thing about this, or the other element of it is that at least if there starts to become something more uniform, you're going to see a lot less disparity in that kind of individual situations, and hopefully that'll be easier for kids and young people to deal with, because they'll realise that it's something that applies to everybody, and it's not just, you know, if your parents let you, cool, if they don't, they don't. But yeah, that was my thoughts. And then the only other thing really was, I mean, I've got lots of thoughts on it. I mean, to be honest, my first thought was just like, that's amazing, because I think I've always said that they should ban them in schools anyway, just because of what I know in terms of how it affects people in terms of cognition and their educational performance and stuff. Obviously we know it has benefits, but for the large part, you know, in that actual schooling environment, it's not particularly beneficial. So I think we're also underestimating probably how much schools have already done in their own way to implement this. So we were actually talking about this in the office last week. Wayne was talking about it in one of his friends' children's school, how they actually go as far to pat them down and scan them every single day to check whether or not they've got phones in their pockets. So they already are implementing that, and that was before this idea of the ban, and they're not allowed to have them on them at all. And I don't think in that school they even allow them just to even bring them in full stop. It's just you cannot come in with a phone. And then Adam was talking about how in his cousin's school, I think it was his cousin, they have little metal bags that are locked with a magnet, and you literally have to put it in, lock it with a magnet, and put it in a special cupboard for the entire day. And it almost sounds like they're casing it in iron and no signal's going to get in, right? But they've been doing that again for a little while. So I think maybe we underestimate how much schools actually are already implementing it. But like you said, I think there is a huge disparity. I wouldn't assume that many schools would be okay with students just sitting, having them out during lessons. I think most teachers reasonably or within reason would say, please put them away. Of course, you're going to get the odd student going in the back looking at it or whatever, but that's just human nature. But I think for the most part, they would be away in lessons. It's just whether or not they have access to them in the corridors and at lunchtime and the end of the day. And I suppose that's when it becomes problematic, because we know that when you go on a phone or you engage with a screen, it can basically impact your attention and your processing for about 20 minutes or so. So you are not as good at kind of like processing cognitive tasks, solving tasks, those kind of things, or at least you're not fully optimal for about 20 minutes after you've engaged with the phone for as little as a few minutes. And that clock starts again every single time you look at a screen. And the thing is that phones are so hardwired to get your attention to do that. They suck you back in. So yeah, you have a quick break for 20 minutes at the end of the lesson. You look on your phone. You're looking on it right until the time at which the teacher comes in. Right, the teacher tells you to put it away. You put it away, but then you've already lost that first best 20 minutes of a lesson. They go out the room for 5 minutes halfway through. You check it again. You've lost another kind of so many minutes. And I think that's probably what the schools and the government are trying to avoid, is that if you keep incrementally having it, it is going to affect your performance throughout the day. And if they can kind of remove it during that sort of 9 to 3 or 9 to 4, then hopefully that'll have a positive effect. But yeah.
You mentioned the idea of like having it that 20 minutes. I mean, I suppose that's like, lots of people say like if you can see your phone, you have it on your desk, or like you know it's in your pocket and you can feel the weight of it in there. It's that temptation, isn't it, to think, oh, my phone's there, I could do something with it. Oh, I'm going to suppress that. I've got my task I'm supposed to do.
And studies show that if you have a phone on a table or somewhere visible, you perform less well on tasks than you do if it's completely out of mind. And I think it's because, like you just said, it's because your brain is essentially it's got to inhibit all of those kind of like, I could be checking it, I want to do it sort of thing, but it's just thinking about the phone. So.
Yeah. No, I mean, we often say like this idea of like multitasking, and it's always funny. Like I talk to students a lot about this because one of my areas of research is task switching. I like cognitive flexibility, and it often blows people's minds when we go, multitasking isn't a thing. You can't actually, in the way that we like talk about it, like, okay, I can look at something and I can smell something, and technically I'm doing 2 different tasks at once. But the idea of like, I can be thinking about my phone and thinking about my schoolwork, it's just not a thing. And what you do is you have to flip between these 2 tasks. And so when I've got my phone, like if it's not the fact that, okay, I'm still working but I'm aware of my phone, it's this idea that, yeah, but I'm constantly switching, and that switching is putting like a cognitive load on me.
Yeah.
And that's then meaning that even when I am doing that task and I'm not playing around with that phone in my pocket, I'm still like suppressing my ability to do anything, which is always like, that's the concern. That's where you start to see that like some of my work's been in like things like anxiety, like educational anxiety. And like as soon as you start putting load on, and then like you start building up this situation where that pressure really starts to set in, and then students start to use that load to then like build more load from getting stressed out from, oh my god, I'm struggling with this and I'm distracted with my phone and everything. But you mentioned the social media stuff as well, like banning social media. And I'm curious if you think, so phones are now banned and students aren't using their phones, this idea that parents might now start going, well, do I need to get my kid a phone if they can't have it for most of the day, maybe for like the evenings and weekends? But then, like, does it make sense to buy them one for the evenings and weekend? I imagine that the answer will be that most people will say, yeah, I'm still going to get them a phone for those times anyway.
For now, maybe, but yeah.
Yeah, maybe it'll change. But I'm curious as to if that then logically translates into students are then not really using phones throughout the day. They're learning to be able to like focus on the school tasks that we give them. And that then makes them less interested in social media because they're not using it as much. Or if that interest then gets like hyper condensed into the evenings and weekends.
That's a good point.
There's this like problem with like cyberbullying, for example. And like cyberbullying in like school where people are like texting about each other is really difficult to track because you basically got to take the phone off of the students. And so like you end up with this, like you remove the phones and now cyberbullying becomes just regular bullying. Yes. I don't think it's going to disappear. Like that's a separate problem, but at least it's more like visible. Like you can see when somebody's being bullied by being like pushed around, for example. When it's like whispering and spreading rumours, it's again, we go back to it's hard to verify it.
Yeah, relational bullying, we call that. Like,
yeah. So I'm just curious as to how that might influence. Will we need a social media ban if the school ban goes successfully?
That's a really good question. You've raised loads of really interesting things. So I think we probably will, because I don't think that banning phones in school time is going to remove that very primal kind of humanistic drive to acquire information. You can translate human, or is it, I always get this wrong, it's either human or Homo sapien is somehow translated to knowing man or something like that. Is it a philosophical thing? I'm sure I did this in A-level philosophy and it's just gone wrong.
Years ago.
But I hold on to this idea that it's something to do with it can be translated in some way to like knowing man, and basically that we have this absolute desire for knowledge. That's what makes us really uniquely human, as well as like language and all those kind of things. Like we like to learn, we like to build tools, we like to do all those kind of things. And I think because of that, we're so hardwired to understand socially our environment, basically what's going on around us and what everyone else is doing and how they're connected to each other, that we've got this tool to do that beyond our immediate local environment. It's just too big a draw. We've always had things like gossip and hearsay, and once upon a time all of this kind of information would have been through just people chatting and rumours and ravens sending messages, like whatever it was, kind of like smoke signals, I don't know, cave paintings, whatever it was, that kind of social communication and social information about kind of, stuff going on. And gradually over hundreds and thousands of years or whatever, it's like evolved into sort of like actual printed media. So there would have started to become tabloids, and then there was magazines, and then there was the internet, and then there was suddenly social media. But all it's done really is kind of just increase that space almost of our sort of like social awareness. It's gone from sort of very local, and this is another reason when I've been thinking about my own sort of like media ban, that hundreds of years ago this would have just been reality. I wouldn't have had a clue what was going on in Europe, America, or wherever. Like I just wouldn't have known, and it wouldn't have mattered to me necessarily. The only information I would have maybe got was like a weekly newspaper or something like that. And yeah, over time it's just spread, and I just think our draw to finding out what is fashionable, important, and what everyone else knows and how that might affect us because it's so important for survival is just so big that I don't think we'll ever be pushed away from social media, if I'm honest, because it's just too hardwired. But I think it's really important what you said about how, well, if you can't get that fix throughout the day, but you suddenly do have access to it in the evenings or at weekends, does that then kind of hyper-focus the time that you're spent on it trying to get that fix? And then it potentially takes away from other things. So now you've got a generation who are almost kind of starved of that sort of during the day, but then in the evenings they've got to catch up on that, so that they're not doing other things they're supposed to be doing. So that's a potential issue, I think. But yeah, cyberbullying is also another huge one. I talk quite a lot about cyberbullying in the sessions that I teach at undergrad and postgrad. We quite often talk about how it is both similar and dissimilar to bullying. So I specialise a little bit in kind of like sort of like traditional, I always air quote that, like bullying and then also cyberbullying a little bit. So one of the biggest differences obviously between bullying and cyberbullying is that basically 24-hour access. It changes the environment, so it's no longer something that kind of, I mean, even traditional bullying doesn't have to be face-to-face, real time. It can be, like you said, relational, where it's more about rumour spreading. It can be both what we call direct and indirect. So indirect is where you might have a ringleader gets everyone in their group to somehow negatively impact somebody else.
Don't play with them because they're...
Yeah, kind of thing. Or you can't sit with us. Or I always use Mean Girl references whenever I'm teaching bullying stuff. Like, but yeah, so, you know, and that could potentially, you know, almost kind of like spread in like a what's the word? Ribosome? I always get that wrong. Do you know what I mean though? It kind of like spreads out kind of like socially through a network of people. So it might not even be necessarily in real time. But the thing with cyberbullying is it can be literally 24/7 because it exists in a digital space. And that's really problematic. And then you also get something that we call the online disinhibition effect, which is where essentially our behaviour is just different online, full stop. So you will say things online, and we'll all say it, that we would probably never say to somebody face to face. Even if it's something nice, you probably just wouldn't phrase it in the same way face to face because of social formalities or whatever as you would do online. And you also get things like power imbalance online, but the way that, so in the traditional definition of bullying, it's basically repeated acts of kind of like violence or aggression or harm over time where there is a power imbalance and it's intended basically. There's different parts of definition, but the power imbalance when it comes to things like cyberbullying is stuff like social network, technology skills, those kind of things. Because you can imagine that one child might be really great at AI and editing and all these kind of things, can make a really kind of sophisticated sort of like video deep fake or something of somebody and post it online, but then another person doesn't have those tech skills. So that's where you get the power imbalance in that kind of digital space. So yeah, it definitely opens up lots of kind of worries and questions. And I think as technology evolves, the risk that it has to things like cyberbullying also evolves. Bullying, again, I hate to say it's a part of human nature because it's a horrible way to describe it, but if you think about the way that all social creatures and mammals interact, at some level there's always some kind of aggression, and you know, it feeds into things like status and social standing and that kind of like competition and establishing identity and all those kind of things. Like, you know, again, that is a part and parcel of like human behaviour, but I think it's only ever going to be limited by what technology exists. And who knows if one day we won't be kind of like VRing into each other's personal spaces to like say something horrible. I hope not, but like it's, you know, the limit is what is there technology wise basically, so we don't know how that's going to evolve either. So how did we, because we've kind of gone a little bit off topic with sort of cyberbullying.
So
do we think it's a good thing? I mean, I didn't ask you, do you think it's a good thing?
So I think the thing, so my, like, one of my main interests one of my main interests with educational like psychology is more focused on like adult education, so like university higher education. And I mean, we're dealing with a lot of problems at the moment with getting students to just self-regulate in class.
Yeah.
Getting them, I had a student playing Roblox on his laptop in one of my seminars. In the middle of a task, I'd set them all a task, and they're all on the computers looking at papers, and I walk and I turn around and he's playing some game, and I come up behind him and I go, I say something like, I didn't realise they started putting academic papers in Roblox, that's a new update. And he was like, oh yeah, sorry, yeah.
That's the coolest response you ever
yeah. And but it keeps happening with you're in a class and everybody at some point has to pull their phone out and check it. And it's there's a part of it where you go, with the school band, I was kind of thinking, you mentioned AI and stuff, and part of me wonders
yes,
one of the good things but also the bad things is regulation and control of information. So you go to school, phones are banned, what you are told by your teacher is assumed to be the truth. Whereas when you have access to a phone, that gives you the ability to then query that.
True.
Now, education within schools is it's very tightly regulated. So is the stuff that they're teaching you some government ploy or whatever? No, because the government aren't the ones that directly oversee what you do within your classroom. But having that ability for a student to go, I really just didn't get how we do integers in maths class, and I'm just gonna chat GPT, how do I do this? Oh, I get that, now I can do my classwork.
Yeah.
However, and so again, another thing I'm interested in educational side is AI. Very interested in what is AI, how do we use it, what does it do for us? Nobody's really using it for that. In my scenario, it's this would be a good
I have a PhD student who's actually doing AI and dyslexia, so they're looking at how they can use it, but much at the start of their project.
No, I mean, I've got a good friend that's very into AI, that's very pro AI for accessibility, but I'm on the other side of that perspective. I kind of go with when you've got these difficulties, you don't understand that integer, for example, within your math class, for whatever reason, you just don't get the concept. That struggle is also a part of that learning process.
It is.
And I suppose it's maybe about teaching students to be I need to ask my math teacher, could you go over it again because I don't understand it, rather than just shutting down and being well, I just don't get it, so I'm just not going to do anything. So I suppose it's kind of I don't know if it's good or bad. I would say not allowing students to have phones so that they can't check information isn't a good thing, but I don't really trust that as a general approach that students are using their phones for that. They're not being taught to do it that way. So even if they are doing it and they do it in the effective ways, I'm looking here, for example, at ways that we can train our students on how to use AI appropriately within education. Because again, you can't just assume that they know how to use these tools all at the same level in the same way. So I think it'd be interesting to see the ban go through, and then see how the university students that we then get, how they then change as a result. Because there is this slow decline in attention span in students that we're seeing. And when I was in university in 2011, I did my undergrad. I remember being in a massive lecture hall. There was 350 of us in this huge hall, and somebody in front of me was playing Minecraft because it had just come out. It was in its beta at that time. Maybe it was 2012. And so there's always been a case of, I've got a bit of technology, I'm going to use it, but the amount of people doing that was very, very limited. Very clear memories that people very, very rarely had to use their phones. They would whisper to each other, but they still whisper to each other now, but there's a load more. Everybody's constantly having to check their phones, and I'm having to spend a lot of time in classes going around going, come on, back on task, come on guys. I very much appreciate that having that technology and that big drive to I'm compelled to have to use my phone, but I am excited to see the concept that people will be able to learn, or it's not even learning to self-regulate that attention better. Having those phones is causing our ability to self-regulate to degenerate. We're losing that ability rather than learning to not do it, if that makes sense. I don't know if you...
Yeah, I want to pick up on a couple of things. So my first thought then when you said that was do you think we should extend the ban to sort of unis as well? I mean, kind of I guess it comes back to this idea of, would you then be sort of limit, because we use it a lot obviously for sort of tasks and interactive things and kind of like I said, research, quite often we'll say, right, you know, go off and go on to PsycInfo and research this paper, and you would like to hope that everyone will pull out a laptop, but they don't. You know, a lot of students will pull out a phone and they need it for that, and that's fair enough. But no, the thing that you're talking about, kind of like the finding information in different sources. So I'm big into connectivism as like a learning sort of like, so I think, to be honest, our areas are so similar, because I'm like a cognitive educational and like, yeah, sort of love kind of like technology and the impact, and connectivism is something that I've been going on and on and on about for years, even though actually it's a little bit of an outdated learning theory now, because it comes from like 2006, and like we've kind of moved on from that. You're talking like 20 years old. They were kind of ahead of their time, I think that's the thing. So yeah, connectivism is basically the idea that in a modern digital world, you can, to understand a concept, a learner has to basically connect different pieces of information. So they first would hear it from a teacher, they don't quite get it maybe, so they then go and watch a YouTube video. The YouTube video talks about a charity, they go to that charity's website who recommends some reading, they do the reading, and they find out that actually they do understand the whole concept to start, because they put all of that information together, and all these little bits become part of a whole. And basically connectivism suggests that in a digital world, that's how students will learn predominantly going forwards. And it's definitely something that we promote at uni. We're just like, right, we will tell you, but then you now go out and do the wider reading, you find the different sources. And I suppose if you start to limit access to digital technology, then you're absolutely right. You're limiting that kind of connectivist sort of like model of kind of like education. And that's why I mentioned like the rhizomes earlier, because like the rhizomatic learning theory is kind of like similar, but it's more to do with sort of like having that kind of social hive and network. So like the rhizomes are like the roots that are all connected underneath like the rainforest, that kind of thing. Like Last of Us, that's...
Oh yeah.
I was like, what's the pop
fungal
culture
zombie,
like? Yeah, that's like a rhizome basically. It's all sort of like connected to sort of like a central kind of like database, and you could almost think of like AI as being a bit of a rhizome in a way, in that we feed back into it, and then that feeds into our collective knowledge. And the worry with things like AI sometimes is that we might start to trust it too much as a source of truth, even though you talk about it being something that you can use it to verify or check, because we know it's wrong, but also we know that it only learns based off the content that we have. So as we feed back into this big body of global knowledge, it then feeds it back out to us, and we just kind of regurgitate it, but we're only really just feeding the same structure rather than actually kind of expanding critically on that in a way. And it's almost like AI may stunt our global knowledge in a way.
I think I'll get you back in and we'll talk about AI, because I rant about AI all the time. We'll do an episode just on AI.
Yeah, because
I mean definitely I think it's...
But I think with the phone things, because I know that we've got to sort of like wrap it up in a minute, I think it's a double-edged sword, because you want people to have access to things like fact-checking and that kind of information, but again, we also know that AI can limit processing power and critical thinking for much longer than things like phone screens can in of themselves. So some studies have shown that it can have an impact on processing for like a week or two after you've been using things like AI constantly to get the answers rather than critically thinking for yourself. So the worry that I think we have with some students is that they're not really thinking for themselves, because I always say that humans are like water. We will take the easiest route. If you get asked a question in a seminar or in a lesson, if you can just quickly chat GPT it, how much easier is that? How much less cognitive resources spent is that than than actually having to think of the answer? So it could be that phones in the long run are just stopping young people learning because they're not really thinking for themselves. So I think taking it away in that structured school time can only be beneficial to at least grow the hardwire neurologically for processing and critiquing information. And once that's developed, of course, bring it back in and use it as a resource, because we're in a world now where AI is becoming so integral and technology is so integral that to not be able to use these things is going to put you back, because it improves things like productivity, for example. So we've got to work it into education, but maybe it's something that we do just reserve for uni forwards, because up until that point, brains are just still growing too much in terms of their infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, maybe to go back to the regulation, I mean, the regulation had stipulated, like, by phones, it means smart devices, like watches. They also said anything that records videos and stuff, so I suppose, like, video cameras are, like, included under that.
But they could still have laptops and kind of...
Yeah, and those would then be the school's policy for them. So I suppose... like, we can meet that delicate balance of they can use this technology to help their learning.
What about stuff like the postcode lottery?
Postcode lottery?
In terms of education
and
funding.
Yeah,
so that's what I worried about when it's... Because I know what you mean. Like, in theory, you should be able to take all of that out.
Yeah.
And then, in an ideal world, they'd all have, like, Macs, right? And they could just do amazing work. But not all schools are going to have funding for that. Like, and then it really just depends on... then it becomes a postcode lottery because some local authorities will be able to fund it better and some just won't. Phones are relatively, they're not cheap, but you can get them and you can get contracts that are now so cheap. I'm sure
I pay like £5 a month.
Yeah, we did talk about this, didn't we? How like it's almost become so accessible to get data that it's almost priced itself out of the market, and now it's just, it used to be like 40 quid for a contract and now it's like a £5 a month, so that's affordable for a lot of people, whereas a fancy computer isn't. So
I suppose, so is our conclusion maybe then that we said, okay, the band's good, and then we got to this point where we're going, oh no, maybe the band's not good because it's going to disadvantage students that are in their setting. However, I suppose if you're in an area of poverty where the school can't afford that, are you then having students that can't, like some of them can, some of them can't afford phones? You're then in a scenario where you're going, families then have to make a sacrifice to buy a device for their child to then take into school because the school can't afford it. And you're then introducing a new problem of, if you ban the phones, then everybody's on an equal level, but nobody has the technology. If you don't ban the phones, then everybody could have the technology, but it depends on if you've got the resources to. So
it's tricky,
very tricky. Okay, I don't think we're going to solve this overnight.
I don't think so.
Okay.
No.
So
I do wish though, and I do wish that the government had maybe employed a little bit more. I mean, maybe they did, because it's quite common practice for, sort of like educational policy to be informed by like sort of research at universities and stuff. But I get the impression that for this one, there's not been an awful lot of connection between academia and the policy that's come out. Because I think, we've discussed some really important points today that I just wonder whether or not they brought to the table at the time. But
I'd hope so. The document itself obviously doesn't reference anything, but I wouldn't expect it to. So I guess you've just kind of got to put the trust into the fact that a lot of these people that are involved in these systems are or were researchers. But I suppose kind of like we've said with, do you ban it and then students that are disadvantaged, you're not really going to win. You've always got to make concede something somewhere, and it's about, do you concede a little bit and disadvantage some people, or do you concede a lot and then everybody's at a fair level but they're all disadvantaged?
Or do the government ban it but understand they therefore have a responsibility to equip all schools with tech?
That would be nice.
Yeah.
that'd be a good end for that. But I don't think that's going to happen, unfortunately.
I don't think so.
Okay, so let's wrap that up there. Thank you very much. Hopefully this has been interesting for everybody that has listened and watched. We will keep doing this. I think we've got a lot to set the world to rights.
Yeah.
And I'll see if I can get some other people in and talk about some other topics as well. So if you've enjoyed this, it'd be nice to hear people's thoughts about some of the stuff that we've been talking about. Maybe something out of a perspective that maybe we've not considered, or maybe reinforces something that we have talked about, and any topics you'd like us to talk in the future. Do feel free to mention it and we'll have a look and we'll see what we can do.